Okay, we're recording. I got a recorded message saying I was recording. Okay, that was a bit weird.
I
Did you get
got
it?
a warning as well.
What was
Excuse me?
that?
No, I got a warning as well that I'm being recorded.
Okay. Well, it might be something to do with the Air Force flying overhead last week that we talked about. Oh, well, we'll continue. I've had my phone tapped. We're not going to talk about that anyway, and we are recording, so I'll watch what I'm saying. Anyway, today, last week we talked about populism, very interesting topic. And this week we're going to talk about a very interesting region, which in a way is located, it's related to populism as well in a political sense. But the region we're going to be talking about is Appalachia. And maybe not all that many people in America know that much about it. But if you think about popular stereotypes like hillbillies and ignorant people and so forth, there's a lot of misconceptions. But Appalachia, before we actually start talking about it, I thought I'd give a general introduction of what Appalachia actually is and what parts of the United States it actually covers. First of all, you have, if you visualize, unfortunately we don't have illustrations, but visualize a map of the eastern part of the United States. And there's a very famous mountain range going from the south, from like around Mississippi, up to southern New York. And this is the Appalachian Mountain range. And this is given, the mountain range has given its name to this area, Appalachia, which became rather very well known in the 1960s in America because of the war on poverty. And it was found that people living in this Appalachian region from northern Mississippi, Alabama, all the way up to New York State, that lots of people were living in poverty. I should also clarify, we talk about the Appalachian Mountains, but I mean, it's an enormously diverse area, and the Appalachian Mountains themselves are actually a series of mountains. And in terms of ecology and geology and flora and fauna, you have a lot of distinct areas. So for a variety of reasons, we'll be talking about economics and politics and human beings. But for a variety of reasons, this is an enormously interesting region. I'll just give some facts and figures so you get an idea, since we don't have a map, since I'm technically challenged. I guess I could have made an overhead or something. But you get the general picture. So as it goes parallel, like to the eastern coast from Mississippi up to New York State. And there are, checking my notes, approximately 25 million people living there, which again says something. It's a very big region. We're talking about the population of 2 Swedens in this one area. 25, looking at my notes again, 25 million people, and it covers, and I'll give this in square kilometers, which means nothing to me, but it covers 1.9 million kilometers, which I guess is a lot. And the mountain range itself, we're talking about the physical characteristics, it was formed actually, we think, 480 million years ago. So it's really ancient. It's probably one of the oldest, if not the oldest mountain range in America. And by contrast, just to get a historical geological idea, if you think of the Rocky Mountains, and everybody knows what they look like, the Rocky Mountains, these sharp boulders and everything, that's a young mountain range. And at one time in deep geological history, the Appalachians looked like that. But now they don't. It's a very low sort of rolling, not rolling hills, but they're mountains, but they're covered with vegetation and covered with trees and everything. And it makes it, to say, geologically and ecologically an enormously interesting area. 25 million people, and it covers parts of 13 states, or I should say really 12 states plus one state entirely, and that's the state of West Virginia, which I have a special interest in because I studied there at a college for 3 years. So West Virginia is entirely within the Appalachian region, but it touches on 13 states altogether. I think I have the numbers right. So you're talking about, besides West Virginia, you're talking about parts of New York State, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maryland, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. So again, this gives you an idea of not only the extent of the Appalachian region, but also the diversity. These are all very, very different states. And we say in general, there's a difference between the southern and the northern parts of Appalachia. The main problems being in the north. So those are some basic facts. Since we won't have a chance to come back to this, I'll just mention one other very interesting geological link. If you want to find a place that, in terms of the vegetation, the trees and the plants growing there, if you want to find a place like that, you won't find it in America, but you will find it in southern China. And for whatever, the reason is that the glaciers never completely covered these two parts. So that, at least the argument is, that the vegetation there is what existed throughout their respective continents before the glaciers came down. So I think that is just sort of mind-blowing in several ways. One, in terms of geological time, but also the fact that you have this very concrete link between the Appalachians and southern China, because all the talk now is about US competing with China. China's bad, US is good. There's a deeper link between the two countries. And there are special orchids that you'll find in the Appalachians that you only find in southern China. And again, maybe this doesn't interest anybody, but I find it totally mind-blowing. We're away from politics and economics, but if there's a connection which is deeper really than anything. So it's a big area, 25 million people, and touching on 13 different states, and West Virginia being the states that's entirely included in Appalachia. So, Anders, would you like to add something to that? But especially, why should we be interested in Appalachia? And C, why are you interested in Appalachia?
Yeah, it's kind of weird, I guess. No, I think the connection to southern China is, sorry, helicopter flying overhead.
You have them today.
I think the connection to the nature of southern China is definitely interesting. Like, one of the most striking things about Appalachia is just like the breathtaking natural beauty.
Yeah.
It has, like, in my opinion at least, the most beautiful nature in all of North America. And it also has like a really distinct and interesting culture.
Yes.
Regional culture, and specifically the music. Like, it's basically the center of American folk music, American folk music tradition. And also for someone like me who's interested in unions and labor history and stuff like that, for reasons that will become obvious later on, it's like historically one of the most interesting regions of the US as well. So I mean, even for like a guy from Uppsala, Sweden, like me, there's all kinds of reasons to be interested in Appalachia, I would say.
But people have some preconceived ideas about, I mean, both within America, but maybe especially Sweden or other countries, because you're not in America. What are these preconceived?
Well, that's another reason why I think people should be more interested in Appalachia than they are at the moment and have been historically, because it's probably the most stereotyped part of America as well.
Right.
The stereotypical Appalachian is like an uneducated, just ignorant, racist hick or redneck, like shotgun over his shoulder, sitting on the porch, drinking moonshine and yelling at passersby, basically. And it's deeply unfair, and it's if anything is ignorant, that's like, that is, I would say, yes. It's a region and a people that deserve more recognition for yes. the development of the modern U.S. than they yes. have. It's the region and the people that have paid the highest price for the modern development of America.
Definitely.
And also it's like I implied earlier, it's historically been a hotbed of quite radical politics and quite left-wing politics. Mm. And that's like the unfair stereotyping of Appalachia has been it's been quite apparent since Trump won the election in 2016. The people who got blamed for that were well, mainly people further up north in the Midwest, the post-industrial Midwest, but also like people in places like West Virginia, for example. Yeah. But I would argue that those aren't the people to blame for Trump's election. Like if anything, them voting for the Republicans is like a natural outcome of historical processes.
Yeah, definitely.
Get into. So it's, I mean, it's, I think people have an obligation to educate themselves on Appalachia, stop stereotyping it, and try to like find a deeper understanding of it.
Right.
Which is fairness.
Yeah, which is what we're trying to do. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So both Anders and I, for different reasons, have both intellectual attachment or interest in this area because of politics and economics, and same thing with labor history and politics. But also, I have a strong personal connection, which I already mentioned. I studied 3 years at a small college up in the hills in the panhandle of West Virginia. But also my father came from Kentucky alongside the Ohio River, Newport, Kentucky, across the river from Cincinnati. I don't know what Newport is like today, but when he was growing up there in the beginning of the 20th century, it wasn't a high rent area, let's put it that way. The only picture I have of the outdoors it must have been their home, because it's my father as a young child, and I guess what was supposed to be a backyard. And it must, maybe after the rain or whatever, but it was just dirt, and my father was dirty. And anyway, he grew up, well, it's a family story, he grew up, he and his sister, alongside the Ohio River. That's another thing, aspect of Appalachia, the Ohio River. They grew up alongside the Ohio River, and then, as my father said, sometimes in the Ohio River, because it had a tendency to overflow its banks. But when I was traveling back and forth to this college in West Virginia, I mean, traveling through southern Ohio and then along the Ohio River, again, it's so unique. You don't find this in other parts of the country. For example, how houses both on the West Virginia side and Ohio, when you get down to southern Ohio, the houses are right on the river. I mean, of course, they're going to flood, and periodically, I guess my dad's family would have to move up to the mountains. And there's stories about that we won't go into. But also my father and my grandfather were musicians. Even though they were classical musicians, I grew up with also a love for country music. And And yeah, it's a very interesting cultural area. And we highly recommend people to look at, especially contemporary Appalachian music, because it's quite, well, both traditional and contemporary, but it's just fascinating. And also, maybe before we get into the economics, say something ethnically about Appalachia. It's a very interesting region because, I mean, when people, white settlers started coming to America, and there were Native Americans there, which we'll have to take up in another video, but they came from a variety of places. And in Appalachia, you tended to get people, yes, from England, but especially from Ireland, from Scotland, so-called Scots-Irish, which were people who had moved to Northern Ireland. You have a mixture of these cultures. And this is also where the folk music comes from, because you recognize there's an English folk music, Irish folk music, et cetera, et cetera. And you also have, even though percentage-wise not all that great, a Black population and also Native American. Again, percentage-wise, not all that great, but it's a very interesting mix of cultural backgrounds. Yeah, so that's another thing. So in terms of music, in terms of ethnicity, it's in terms of ecology, it's a very diverse, interesting place. So maybe we've hinted at this around us, but maybe we set the scene for, yeah, what was the dominant feature, what really determined the modern future of Appalachia, and that was coal. So Anders, tell us a bit about the importance of coal and whether it was good or bad for, whoops, that was my microphone, I almost knocked over. Sorry, I use my hands too much. I get excited talking about Appalachia. I want to go back again. Yeah, so coal, what was it good or bad for Appalachia, West Virginia?
Well, depends on who you ask, I guess. But like coal is, it's impossible to get around talking about coal, because if anything has shaped Appalachia, and I'd argue America and like industrial civilization in general, it's coal. It's been the major source of energy for industrial production from basically from the start of the Industrial Revolution up until about the 1950s, when oil started to take over. But up until then, basically all industrial production was coal-driven, as well as most transportation, and also once firewood started to dry up, it became like a normal common source of home heating as well. So it's been enormously important. And one of the curses of Appalachia historically has been it's quite rich in natural resources.
Right.
It doesn't just have like natural beauty and biological diversity. It has tons and tons of minerals as well, and especially coal. And the coal in Appalachia, especially like central Appalachia, West Virginia, primarily southern West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and the western part of Virginia has very rich coal deposits, and it's very high quality coal as well. And coal extraction started actually in western Virginia, western Pennsylvania, sorry, because they have like very rich deposits of anthracite coal, which is like stone coal, which is the highest grade, the purest coal. And unfortunately, that started to dry up because it's quite a rare sort of coal. And at that point, in the 1880s, once technology made it possible to mine through mountains and stuff like that, and draw railroads into mountainous areas. People started prospecting for coal in deeper in the Appalachians in West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, which has tons of bituminous coal, which is commonly known as black coal. And that's also like quite a high grade coal. And the advent of the railroad and modern tunneling techniques and stuff like that made it possible to extend infrastructure into the region and start digging up the hillsides and extract the coal deposits. And this is something that, first of all, like I said, it basically determined the building of infrastructure and the patterns of new settlements. People already lived in the region, but those people were usually displaced once coal extraction got going. What usually happened was foreign investors and capital owners on the East Coast bought up huge tracts of these areas and leased them to coal companies, coal operators who mined coal in exchange for paying royalties to the landowners. And this led to like a massive need for labor force, which in turn meant that lots of people moved into the region, and it also led to quite serious social problems, unfortunately. These people generally settled in so-called company towns set up by the coal operators, and these company towns were exclusively populated by people who worked in the mines. They were basically wholly owned by the businesses owning the coal mines. And do you want to say something about company towns, or do you have any?
So you can get a drink. Yeah, no, definitely. No, I was going to ask you. No, I think it's again, it's something grow with American history, and but it's just so amazing. But something needs to be emphasized to people who aren't familiar with this. That the company towns would start with that because the miners, the people living there, people working there, didn't own anything. There's lots of folk songs about the company town and all this thing, but it was quite amazing that first of all, and this is still a problem today. I read recently that land ownership in Appalachia, we'll be talking more about the present day situation later, but it's a lot of the land is still owned by people in the East or corporations or whatever. So how do you develop that land? So yeah, you have this strange situation where the company they owned the mine, they owned the store, they owned your home, they owned your life because they told you, to go down the mine and how much you were going to make or not make and so forth. So it was quite it wasn't exactly slavery, but you had actually no rights whatsoever. And this is a very unique situation. One reason they could get away with it, and something you and I talked about a little bit before the recording, was that you're talking about isolated areas. And if you're anywhere in Appalachia up in the mountains, it can feel pretty isolated. But the mining companies controlled by people back east, they had total control over the lives of the people living there. And that's important to understand when we talk about the labor history. But again, just to emphasize how enormously important. So coal was basically underwriting the entire industrial revolution in the United States. Just like Northern England, Newcastle, how the coal mining in England created the industrial revolution there. And so say it lasting all the way to the 1950s when petroleum started to make inroads. But one can underestimate the enormous importance this region had with these coal mines for the entire country.
Yeah, and this
So
is
I'll turn things back to you on that note.
yeah, it's important to keep in mind later on when we're going to discuss the situation today, that this region basically paved the way for our kind of society. And you might say that we owe them some kind of debt for that. But
Just
anyway, like,
interrupt there for a second. It has to do with England, but there's a classic essay by George Orwell. It's called Down a Mine in the 1930s. It's part of the book The Road to Wigan Pier, in which, in this essay, and Orwell is making the same point. That's why I interrupted you. He says, we owe coal miners. This is, civilization is based on coal. And Orwell liked to experience things. Like when he was in Spain, he was in a militia and he was shot in the throat. And he describes in detail what it's like to be shot in the throat. But for a miner, he said, if I'm going to understand what it's like to be a miner, even though I'm 6'2", I'm going to go down in the mine. And I would recommend this essay, Down a Mine, because following this very tall person down a very narrow mine and what the conditions were like, and maybe not exactly the same conditions in West Virginia, but still gives you an idea of what it was like being a miner. And as I say, Orwell making the point that we owe our civilization to that. So sorry for interrupting. I'll let you continue.
No, thanks. I'm I'm glad you said that. I haven't read that myself, but I'm glad to know I agree with Orwell on something, I guess.
Definitely.
Anyway, it's like you said. Also, it's hard to imagine what it's like working in as a 19th century coal miner. I don't think it's possible for anybody today to understand that kind of labor and what it takes out of you. But also living in company towns, what that must have been like, because most of the people working the mines were, like I said, transplants from other parts of the country or from Europe. A lot of Italians came over to work in the mines, and a lot of Black people from the south came up to work the mines. And these people all lived in very isolated locations, company towns up in the mountains, no roads leading in or out of town. The only way in or out was the railroad owned by your employer. Your house was owned by your employer. You generally got paid in company scrip, which is kind of fake money invented by
monopoly money.
Yeah, monopoly money issued by your employer, which could only be used at the company store. It had no real value. So basically, you didn't get paid for your labor. You got basically your basic needs met. You got food from the company store. Your children got some kind of education, highly controlled by your employer at the company school. On Sundays, you could go to the company church, listen to sermons by the company preacher. And at any point, if you made trouble, say you tried to unionize, for example, your employer could fire you and evict you from your home and just cut you off from everything.
Right.
You had no employment security at all. And to make things worse, policing in these towns was generally carried out by private police forces deputized by the county. So they had legal authority in the mine on the employer's property, but they generally also had legal authority outside of the mine, which meant that if you got fired and set up a tent camp in the woods, to survive on like subsistence farming or something, you could still be harassed by private police forces.
Right.
So it's, I mean, it's not as bad as slavery in the South, but it's just like one step above.
One step above,
It's,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, it's a level of misery that's impossible to comprehend for people today. I think, like, I can't imagine it.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's slave labor basically. Once people moved into these company towns, they're effectively slave labor because they lose all ability to affect their situation.
Right. So what was the response to this? Because, I mean, historically now, I mean, we look back at this period in American history, and it's a very important period in labor history, because people did react. I was going to say, despite these conditions, but also obviously because of these conditions. So maybe you could say something about that. What were labor, as you said, I mean, you could be fired for no reason whatsoever, but still people organized, or they went on strikes, or what happened in these coal fields, in the coal fields? What sort of labor activities? Say something.
Yeah, well, what happened basically was coal miners in other parts of the country had organized earlier. They had like coal mining in West Virginia had been going on for like 10 years or so when the United Mineworkers Union was founded, like the big mining union in the US. And because they had like successful organization elsewhere, they could come in from outside and start organizing people in these areas. Areas that probably wouldn't have become organized. There wouldn't have been any labor activity like natively, or I'll say, because of the just like brutal oppression and surveillance. But anyway, what happened was the non-unionized miners in Eastern Kentucky and West Virginia were used to drive the price of coal down, or drive profits up for coal operators in that region. And this affected workers elsewhere. So the United Mine Workers moved in and started trying to organize people in this area. And what followed on that was decades of violent strife and periods of basically civil war. I think it's the only way to describe it. And like the center of these labor conflicts was an area encompassing like basically the southernmost part of West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky, kind of like a corridor running down from West Virginia to Kentucky. And should I give like a brief overview, just like some examples of how this thing played out? Because I mean, I could talk for like hours about
no, we could, so
coal wars.
No, I'd just like to emphasize, or maybe we're thinking about the same thing, excuse me, but emphasize the violence of labor history in the United States, and not just in the coal fields, but we talked about that's right, when we talked about Amazon trying to or a union trying to organize at Amazon, about the violence that's in the labor movement, and it was quite amazing. So like in Chicago, we were talking about May Day. I was desperately trying to remember what we talked about. I talked about the origin of May Day, that it was actually in America, it's not a Soviet invention. And this was in conjunction with the strikes going on in Chicago, where the military, you had the police, you had the Pinkertons. I mean, people were killed. And out west, you had violence. I mean, throughout American labor history is a history of violence being used by the owners, with the army, with the police, with the Pinkertons, with private police, like you talked about, being used against the miners. It's an incredibly violent history. And yeah, maybe one can even compress it down to this region you're talking about, and consisting of Harlan County, which has a very special reputation in Kentucky, to this violence. But it wasn't only there. I mean, again, because of the way people, the isolated communities, the way people were living compared to, say, out west, to silver mines and so forth. The violence is the same, but it's more compressed in these areas, and it's much more difficult to get away from. So again, just to emphasize to people, especially growing up in Sweden, and I mean, I Odal, and yeah, it was tragic, it was horrible, but that wasn't even one day of violence in the American labor movement history. And people need to be reminded of that, not only in Sweden, but definitely in the United States. So keeping that in mind, this broad outline, tell us more of what went on in Eastern Kentucky and Harlan County, and they're called the Coal Wars, as you say. They go on for like 20 years, but fill in some details.
Yeah, it's a well-deserved name, the Coal Wars. It's violence on a scale that's just, like, frankly unbelievable. It's a conflict that it started with workers trying to unionize in the region, and basically the unions started forming in order to demand basic human rights, I would say, like the right to not have to lease the equipment you use in the mine from the employer, the right to collectively bargain, the right to actually have some kind of security regulations, because this is another thing. People didn't just die from outright violence. The death rate in the mines was just horrendous as well. Like, for example, during World War I, you were actually safer going to Europe with the Allied Expedition Force than you were working as a coal miner in West Virginia, which is just, it's staggering.
I can understand it.
I mean, I'm laughing. It's really not funny, but I mean,
it's the same thing.
It's just insane. And like, for example, one day in 1907 in Monoga, West Virginia, 362 miners were killed in one mine explosion. That's the official death figure. It's probably 2 or 3 times that many people, because common practice was for children to accompany their dads into the mine to help pick slate from the coal and stuff like that. And like, imagine that, like, just like between 400 and 1,000 people killed in one industrial accident. It's misery on a scale that's completely unheard of in America today. So anyway, in the early 1900s in West Virginia, the United Mine Workers Union tried to negotiate for better paying conditions. The most famous strikes are probably the ones in the one in Paint Creek and the neighboring mine, which I can't remember the name of at the moment, embarrassingly. But anyway, there were quite large strikes with many thousands of miners going on strike, demanding better conditions. The companies respond by hiring mercenaries from the Baldwin Felts Agency, private detective agency, who came in and started beating people up firing at them and evicting them from homes, preventing them from using public mine-owned roads and water lines and stuff like that. Just basically trying to starve them into submission. And like the most egregious thing is when they used the mine-owned railroad to run a train through a tent camp occupied by striking miners in the middle of the night, and just firing indiscriminately into the tent camp. That's quite a famous episode. The train was called the Bull Moose Special, and I believe the actual mine owner was on the train, like shouting orders at the, the mercenaries to fire on striking workers. And unfortunately, only one person was killed, but it could have ended much, much worse.
Yeah.
And this led to retaliations and just tons of people getting killed. And in the end, the violence only stopped when the governor called in the National Guard, declared martial law to tamp down the violence. And this is a trend that continues throughout the Cold Wars. Things generally just settle down once martial law is declared and the army moves in, the official army. Unfortunately, the army often sided with the owners of the coal companies, which meant that the situation for the miners didn't really improve. So they kept going on strike and demanding better conditions. And things really came to a head in 1920 when in a small town in Mingo County, which is in the southernmost part of West Virginia, a town called Mattawan. A bunch of miners unionized and were fired in retaliation, as the custom was at the time. Agents from the Baldwin Felts agency started to evict striking miners from their homes. But at this point, the local police chief, a man called Sid Hatfield, stepped in and tried to intervene and just challenged their authority to evict people from homes. And being the local civilian police chief, or I don't quite know what to call him, but the competition police chief, he had some authority, and he was considered the lawful authority by the miners. He was quite popular among the miners.
Okay.
And he and Mattawan mayor, Cable Tesserman, tried to challenge Felt's agency thugs carrying out evictions, and actually tried to arrest two brothers of the chief of the Felt's agency, brothers named Albert and Lee Felts, I think. Things came to a head, a firefight broke out, and 10 people were killed. 7 of them agents of the Felt's agency, among them the brothers of Big Man Felt himself. And this was seen as like a moral victory by the miners. They've actually stood up to the mining companies and held their own. And Sid Hatfield became like a hugely popular figure, the guy who pushed back against the company. And he and 15 others were charged with murder, but they were acquitted by a local jury who basically said that, yeah, the guys from the Felt's agency had it coming, so we're not going to convict these guys of murder. And sometime later, about 6 months later, Sid Hatfield and one of his deputies were assassinated on the steps of a courthouse in a neighboring county when they were to face some other charges. And this led to a huge outcry, and basically mobilized thousands of miners who, long story short, demanded that the governor step in and put an end to the violence by the companies, the coal companies. The governor refused, so the miners took up arms and formed what can really only be described as an army, 13,000 strong, and started marching south towards Mingo County to unionize the county by force, basically. But they were stopped on the way in Logan County, like halfway between Charleston, the capital of West Virginia, and Mingo County, by forces under the command of a local sheriff called Chafin. And Chafin had between 2,000 and 3,000 men under his command, armed with machine guns and a private air force. I mean, this is there's no way getting around it. This is basically a civil war. It's an armed insurrection and a civil war in southern West Virginia. And the 13,000 miners engaged the private security forces on a mountain called Blair Mountain.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. This is what it's all leading up to. The Battle of Blair
Harlan County, Blair Mountain. Okay.
Yeah. The Battle of Blair Mountain raged for approximately a week, depending on when you count the start date. And 100 miners were killed, which is about 1% of the total force, which is in line with armies engaged in combat in war. And 30 people on the other side were killed. And the battle only ended when federal forces stepped in. National Guard units were called in and put a stop to the violence. And one of the reasons is probably that a lot of the miners were veterans from World War I, and they were unwilling to. They had no problem engaging private security forces, but they didn't want to fire on the U.S. Army for obvious reasons. And then after the Battle of Blair Mountain, the Union was basically broken. Membership plummeted, and a lot of people stood trial for murder and treason. About 1,000 people were charged. Some were acquitted, and a lot of people served a lot of jail time for this. And the upside is it brought a lot of attention to the plight of the miners, and a lot of sympathy as well. And this would pay off later on. The focus of the struggle shifted away from outright militancy and armed struggle to political work, which paid off from circa 1932 onwards. And maybe we should get into that. Or do you want to talk?
I don't know, it's just fun listening. No, I didn't know all the details of that. I mean, again, in my upbringing, I mean, also my grandfather, even though he was a trained musician, he was also a typesetter and active in the union, so he wasn't a miner or anything like that. But and even though I never knew my grandfather, he died unfortunately the same day that I was born. But again, lots of family stories and stuff. But he was a very strong union man. He was a typesetter. He was kicked out of the union for picking the wrong Democratic candidate in the primary. He didn't pick Wilson, so. And then they moved from the slum area to what was even then must have been in the 20s, a very nice neighborhood in Cleveland, Lakewood. I never understood because it was really upper middle class. And it's only recently I found out that he died. He was a member of the Masonic Lodge. We talked about Masons before. So he did very well for himself once he got kicked out of the Union. But no, I grew up with, and again, my father, I wouldn't say a strong Union, but I mean, it was just part of the family culture. So I knew about it, and then certain things stand out and it almost becomes Union mythology. Certain places, Harlan County and in Kentucky, where there are also violent confrontation, and the Battle of Blair Mountain. But I must admit, I didn't really know all the details leading up to it. It was very, very interesting to hear that. I knew about this big confrontation, and then as you say, things. Well, they get better with 1932, the New Deal.
Yep.
And I think it was then I shouldn't try to rely on my memory. I tend to get things wrong, but it wasn't then that it was John Lewis who was head of the United Mineworkers, and maybe that comes later, but he's sort of a legendary leader. The name John Lewis comes to mind.
Yeah, he's the guy who called the rally in what's it called? The capital of West Virginia. He called a rally, which gathered like 7,000 miners or something, demanding to speak to the governor. And when that failed, he was the one who organized the miners in taking up arms. But after they started marching, I didn't want to get into like too many details, but at one point they turned back and decided to not not start like an armed insurrection. But then things happened and they took up arms again. But John Lewis was there, and a lot of like other legendary figures as well, like Bill Blizzard and people like that.
The New Deal.
Yeah, it's
the New Deal changes things.
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely. Up until 1932 and the election of FDR, the miners had basically had the government against them the entire time. And that's really the first time that anybody had any interest in meeting their demands, which is kind of incredible because these are people who for 50 years have been carrying the industrialization of America on their shoulders. So you'd think that they'd have something a little better coming, but nobody was really interested in. Like the basic problem is that the coal operators made too much money, and they were able to buy off both politicians and law enforcements.
Right, exactly.
Which made any opposition to them pretty much impossible. And also, like if a miner strikes or dies in the mine, there's a lot of desperate people available to replace that miner. So there wasn't really ever any like labor shortage, and the miners didn't have any leverage against the operators. In the end, the only thing they had was either armed struggle or the outside world stepping in. And ironically, it took something like the Battle of Blair Mountain, which is like the largest armed insurrection since the Civil War, still is today. Nothing like it has happened to this day in America. It took something like that to like awaken public opinion and bring focus to the issue. It's the Battle of Blair Mountain, short-term loss, but long-term success for the miners, I would say.
Exactly. I just think I was looking at the clock. I think we've been talking for almost 40 minutes, have we?
Yeah, close to an hour, I think.
Close to an hour. Yeah, well, yeah, whatever. You say an hour, I say 40. I I can't keep track of time, but we talked before that maybe yeah, instead of trying to squeeze everything into an hour, that we would talk at length. I'm glad we have about the details because they're very important in understanding labor history and this special region of the United States. So maybe we will continue recording, but we're going to divide this into two different episodes.